So can everyone see my screen? Just going through the assignment page now. Cool, perfect. All right. So, and yes, I am recording. Cool. So before we get started, I'll just mention that I know I'm behind on homeworks 3 and 4. And so thank you everyone for being patient, but I am going to focus before homeworks 3 and 4 on getting the getting the final project proposals graded and out to you guys. I think it's more important to get you guys feedback on that, since we're moving more on to JavaScript for homework 5, and then for the rest of the course, it'll be pretty much making our way through homework 5. Homework 6 is going to be in service of the final project, and for most students, I'll provide feedback on your proposal, and it'll include kind of a specific goal to achieve for homework 6. So just I guess to take care of housekeeping here, and if anyone has any lingering questions on the proposals and the final projects. I mentioned in an announcement that while we are starting with JavaScript and homework 6, I'm requesting to be in JavaScript. It doesn't have to be full on D3, but feel free to use tools like Plotly, Vegalite. But the key will be to have it be in a JavaScript environment. And then if you are planning on using another tool, something like Shiny or Dash for the final project, then feel free to just work on something simpler for homework 5 or homework 6 rather, and then focus mainly on getting your final projects in. So in general, there is a lot that's of your grade that's based on the final project. So I think it's more important to begin focusing on that rather than getting bogged down with these last few homework. So any questions just about the requirements, specifically the technical requirements for the final project and for homework 6? Yep, so Sharon just asked in the chat if a JavaScript visualization is required for the final project. A JavaScript visualization won't be required for the final project, but it will be required for homework 6. If you're not planning on using JavaScript for your final project, then for homework 6, feel free to use something like Plotly or Vegalite, which abstracts away a lot of the JavaScript. And in addition, later this week I'll be posting a video about events, trying to get more in depth in terms of JavaScript. But for the purposes of someone not using JavaScript for their final project, just a static image on an HTML page would be okay. And Tala just asked if I would clarify the difference between JavaScript and D3. So this is a good idea to, I'll just get into talking about this here. But so that's what I wanted, d3js.org. So D3 itself, it stands for data-driven documents, and it's a name of a JavaScript library. So d3js.org. This is a great sort of starting point if you're interested in doing something with D3. Um, it's and if I would characterize D3, I would characterize it as a very low level plotting library. So if we go to an example here, this one looks cool. Although that's New York Times, so I don't think the code's going to be readily available there. I guess even we could go to something like this. So this is a county level choropleth, and when you're looking, so like these examples are really good because they're very purpose driven, and it's even great just for inspiration. But as you're searching through these examples, make sure that you're taking a look at all of these, at all of the code samples here, and you could kind of see really what's happening here. That you're essentially building not just your visualization, but almost the whole visualization architecture from scratch. So you could see like you have a lot of helper functions, and D3 is actually, as it's been improving, it's adding more and more purpose-built functions like this. But you could, you're essentially adding, in this case, geopath, and you could see, things like map. But really, it's kind of drawing this from almost base level concepts of, first I have so what it should be doing is it should be grabbing the, so it has a TSV here, and there should be a, okay, so it's not grabbing I think it's using this topo, in this particular example, it's using topo JSON to draw the lines surrounding the countries. And I've seen other examples. I thought this one would be using that, where it actually grabs it from a GeoJSON and draws your map, and then colors it in, colors in the map, depending on what your values are. So here you could see everything is kind of built from the ground up. So things like the tooltip that you see popping up, you have to kind of manually define something like that, and it's that could be very time consuming. So basically, as I mentioned, like D3, it's very low level, and it is very challenging to use. But the benefit of it is, because it's low level, it's so much more powerful. Pretty much, your mind is your only limit. Your imagination is your only limitation in terms of what you're able to do with D3. And looking at some of these examples here, you see a lot of very unique data visualizations. So, like really, D3 was what popularized these kind of force bubble. And this one's not letting you drag it, but a lot of times you saw the animation in the beginning. It kind of teased the fact that there is some gravity component to these, but it's so D3 really it almost led to brand new visualization types. Like, I would argue something like this wouldn't even really be possible without D3. And then for those who do want to delve a bit more deeply in JavaScript, there's also dc.js and crossfilter.js. And I always forget the pages, but so this one's by Square. So this is, I would recommend these for more advanced users, or for people who have experience with JavaScript, or who have just that unique a task that they just are passionate enough to deal with these more lower level languages. But just to kind of give a quick intro, and more just to kind of give you guys a lay of the land in terms of what's there. Crossfilter.js is, it was created by the team at Square and they open sourced it, but it's essentially meant for, like, they bill it as multivariate exploration, but in a way you could almost think of this as the beginnings of data frames for JavaScript. So the examples that you see here, they're very much meant to, be these really ad hoc style, kind of ad hoc seeming visualizations where the you have unique ways of filtering your data, and it really allows for unique ways of viewing multivariate data. And then DC.js is really a package that's bringing together D3 and Crossfilter. So this is kind of the bridge of bringing together those two. So that's sort of on one side of JavaScript. And then to kind of go to the other side in terms of more user-friendly libraries, using something like Plotly, which is itself a wrapper around D3. This is, so for those, and to kind of bring this back to Sharon's question, for those who aren't going to be using JavaScript for their final projects, I highly recommend using Plotly or Vega Lite for homework 6. And something like this, there's like if you just go to Plotly/JavaScript for Vega Lite, they have their own documentation, but this one I know more intimately, so I'll just go through this first. But you could see how something like this, it's it's more straightforward than D3. So it's still it's still a bit more like it's comparable if you've been using Plotly in Python. It's a bit more different from R because R was made to mimic ggplot a bit more. So the gap between JavaScript and R and Plotly and R is a bit wider than the gap between Plotly and Python. But more to the point, it's like this is all about a fairly standard structure. So you basically have a JSON comparable in Python to a dict, and you're basically building that JSON. And when you have a page, you essentially just include this plotly.plot, and you'll be able to essentially like run your page there. Now I was planning on putting this in one of the videos I was going to post later this week, because I do have an events video that I wanted to post to talk about more in depth about JavaScript. But basically, when you're building these files, and I'll just go into my Plotly template. So just to kind of go through what I usually do when I'm working with Plotly in Plotly.js, and sort of we'll use this as our beginning ground for using JavaScript in general. But you have you're essentially including Plotly here. You have and this is for Plotly in particular, but there's a particular Unicode tag that's needed here in order to properly render some of the features. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And and really what you're doing is you have a div that you're accessing. So here my div is, I have a specific ID. I have my ID of graph, and it's just a blank div. And when you're posting something in JavaScript, when you're using JavaScript, essentially you're referencing your document by this ID here. So going back to Plotly.js here, you could see in this plotly.plot command, I won't be going into this here, so ignore this for now. But you could see here that here you have my graph, and you're not seeing it on here, but basically that my graph is also, let me go back here. It's referencing this tag here. And you're using a built-in plotly command to just say, I have my div, I know where I want my chart to be, and I just want to plot something. So in terms of homework 6, something, pretty much utilizing this exact template and building a graph using your final project data, pretty much one graph, that would be okay if you're not using JavaScript and if you're planning on using Shiny or Dash. Really the main purpose of homework 6 is to just ensure that there's, that we're getting, more exposure to JavaScript. I wanted to have 2 homework assignments that that go through that, just since it's, this is really the only class that you guys will be taking that goes through anything JavaScript. And D3, it's it could be argued that it's a bit further away from the data scientist tool belt, but it's definitely something that's used out there, and it's really the standard for web-based visualization. So it's I think it's important to at least get some exposure to it. So does that answer? Yep. And Tala just asked another question about do we have any tutorials that go through D3 in Java? I mentioned in an announcement, and I didn't want to provide too much information, but the book that I mentioned in the announcement, it should be relatively findable out there. Like it's an O'Reilly book, and yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. So this is for Python for data analysis, and then I might not have put it in the announcement. So I think where I might have, I'll put out another announcement with this, but it's there's a book that I recommend in terms of yeah, I'll post an announcement for that. But there is a book that I recommend in terms of W3 Schools is good for, Christopher just posted a link to W3 Schools. That's good for intro JavaScript. There is a, I know I have this in Calibre, so I'll bring this up. It's not this one, but there's another one. I'm blanking on the name of this, but I'll put out an announcement. Yes, thank you. I knew I put it somewhere. Yes, interactive data visualization for the web. So I definitely recommend looking at this book. And in particular, what I'll do is I'll point out, because obviously, I don't want, it would be a lot to just read through this whole book, and really these sorts of books aren't meant to be used that way. What I would recommend is I would kind of skim through this, but the real take home is the so here it goes through just a few like I'd recommend skimming this, but there's in particular so this is in that same chapter. So this is looks like page 61, and this is going to be pretty key in terms of in terms of troubleshooting. So you're able to, and this is built in with Python, so you can pretty much just copy and paste this wherever you're looking. So like here, let me do this. So I have this index HTML here, and if I, that's the password for GoToMeeting, but if I do this, okay, so I usually just do it without the 888 there. So basically just python.m simple HTTP server. And what happens when you do that is it starts a server. So this is similar to what I showed off with Dash, where you kind of notice in your terminal things freeze or not freeze, but it's more busy doing something continuous. What it's doing is spinning up spinning up a server in the case of Dash. Actually, in the case of notebooks, also you could see that happening here. But so I lost my tab. So when you have this running, similarly to with Dash, you have your ports, and you're just accessing your local host at that port. So and I should have been a bit. Actually, it didn't work with 888 because I had. Actually, I may have to. Let me do this. Is that working? Oh, you know what? It is working, and so two things. Something. Okay, so something's happening, and I don't want to shut down my. Let me just. I don't want to shut down my notebook just yet. But so basically, you have to keep an eye on your ports. So that's something I wasn't doing here. But basically, you run it, and then when you go to your local host, let me try this one more time. Actually, what I'm going to do. So I'm kind of cheating here, but I'm going to, and I'll show you why I'm doing this in a second. So I'm renaming this, and then we'll go back here and we'll rerun. There we go. Perfect. So this is what I wanted to see. So those were unfortunately two things that I should have been keeping an eye out for, and I didn't. So one of them is when you do. So you could see here that when you're going to a local host, it's showing the directory listing. So it's essentially, by default, it's showing a file explorer. And the only time it doesn't do that is if you have an index.html in your file explorer. And if it does, then localhost will just default directly to there. So if I click on this, you could see that I'm now in index.html. If I had subfolders, I would be able to access those subfolders and go to pages within those subfolders. And so, this is just how you're able to see something hosted on your local host in the browser. And in terms of troubleshooting, what you'll be doing a lot of is so basically I just right-clicked and went to inspect, and you'll be working like I recommend Chrome, but Firefox has their own developer tools as well. And mainly what you'd be using here is your elements and your console. So to just kind of go through the what you have here, elements. This is essentially building your page. So like here, you could see everything that I have in my template here, and Sharon, I'll get to your question in a bit. So in the page, I basically have, and right now I don't have a Plotly visualization, but what I would do is actually, yeah, Sharon, I'll get to your question now. So first of all, just in terms of elements, that's where these tags are coming from. So these are coming from the page that I have here. And if I wanted to post something, I could just simply copy and paste this. My Plotly folder. There we go. All right, so I save this as test.js. It's in my folder, and I'll, similarly to what I did here, bringing in Plotly.js, I'm going to include my test.js here. And if I shift reload this page, oh, and I just forgot to have the right, so remember the ID was graph, and here we were looking at my graph, so I want to do that, and if I do that, and now you could see the graph show up in the HTML page. So basically, this little template here, you could think of this now as a mini web app. I mean, it is a web app, basically. You have your HTML, you have external JavaScript being brought in, you have your you have kind of your local JavaScript, what you're particularly plotting. And something like this would be, and this is a complex graph. Like normally, normally it's not going to be this involved, but something like this would be, totally fine for homework 6. And yes, Tala homework 6 will be posted next week. But as I mentioned, stay tuned for the to get the project proposals back, because a lot of basically homework 6 is just going to be make a visualization related to your final project data set, and then in the project proposal feedback, you'll get specific tasks to to help out with that. So just to continue this JavaScript intro, so in terms of looking at the text, this chapter here, in particular, this gives you sort of the how to work with servers. And the I think it's this chapter 5, that yes. So what I would recommend is like chapters 3, 4, and 5. Those are really the ones that provide the best introduction. And out of those 3, like chapter 5 is like essentially the way that I would use this as an introduction is start combing through chapter 5, start trying a lot of these toy examples. And if you begin finding sort of if you run into any walls here, then go back to chapters 3 and 4 and try to or look at W3 schools and try to get more information there. But this like especially this chapter, this provides a really good introduction of what's happening in D3, and then by extension, it also gives a lot of intro to how you would be able to use JavaScript in general, and particularly and using a tool like Plotly. So you could look through something like this, realize that it's like it goes through a couple of bar graph examples, and so here you could see like kind of building from first principles what sorts of stuff is happening. And it's so I would begin I would begin looking at this, then kind of realize this is all ridiculous, or this is all like a lot to make a simple bar graph, which is what he ends up with. Coloring off of, like he goes through a lot of examples, and again, really good, but something like this is a lot simpler. Like you have just your plot types that you could go off of, and like you kind of get an idea of how simple a one of these apps could be. So this is a really straightforward line graph, but really this is all the code that's going into it. You have 2 traces standing for the 2 lines. You have your you're building a list of those traces, and then you're accessing that mydiv. And all of these examples, they have these little CodePen insets, so you could or iframes, so you could look at these and really see what's going on. So you can see your JavaScript, and you can see what the result is. So Christopher just asked, why not visualize in an R Markdown HTML file and export all of the code to HTML? And that's a very good question. And I had so R Markdown, like you are able to use, like especially with Plotly, you're able to use it in R build your Markdown document, and what you end up with is a essentially an HTML file with an embedded JavaScript visualization in it. So for something like your final project, if you guys are more comfortable in R, totally feel free to use Shiny, and you'll be building your web apps, and it'll be entirely within the Shiny ecosystem. But what actually happens with an R Markdown file is the data and a lot of extraneous Markdown HTML ends up being included in the Markdown file. So if you ever have one of these Markdown files, you'll notice it's always way larger than really a file like that should be. And the reason is when it compiles the Markdown, it's including all the data, it's including all of the code. It essentially brings it all into one place, and it's something like that. It's like technically it is one of these visualizations in HTML, but sort of looking at the comparison where you have something like this, and really this is all the code that you have. You just have your HTML. The point of homework 6 is to really get kind of a hello world JavaScript visualization down. So unfortunately for homework 6, our markdowns won't be allowed. Actually, getting back at a few of these questions in the chat. So Sharon, your question about the Plotly visualization in HTML, like you were just asking about why this wasn't showing up before, right? Okay, cool. And then in terms of and I recommend going through the interactive data visualizations book to really get a lot of these concepts down. And in terms of actually, so one other thing, I think this is just sort of one trap to avoid when you're working with JavaScript. But one thing to note is over here we're accessing a portion of the document, and we need to be at that point in the document. So like here you could see we've already built our, we already have our div. We could put in raw JavaScript in the script here, but I just put it in a separate file. But if I were to do something like this, and if I go back and try to refresh this, that should have not worked, but did I save my file? Saved it. Next question, did I properly refresh this? Okay, that is working fine. I've run into issues where if there's a lot of times if there's particular placement of where the script is, it's not able to access that that particular element. But basically, to just kind of round out this introduction to using JavaScript like this. There's a lot of using the elements and the console. So within the console, like if there's a line of JavaScript that's not working, if you're trying to debug what you're looking at, the console is really the place to do it. I believe you could even okay, that's not it should be defined in my environment here. A lot of times you could access, and actually the reason why it's not is because it's, yeah, so basically this is using, this might be more confusing, so I apologize, but basically this is using d3.csv to bring in a file like this. And the essentially the way that you'll notice this pattern a lot in JavaScript functions, where you have a essentially a function like this, and then you're utilizing an anonymous function. And for the purposes of CSV, the reason why it's not letting me access data is because it runs this function, including everything inside it, and then all of that is just becomes inaccessible if you're outside that context. So, and this is just the structure of JavaScript. An easier example of looking at something like this is something like this. Cool. So this is a very simple example of how this anonymous function works. And what we're doing here is, you have your object. So in this case, you have an array. We're calling this for each, and we're kind of calling this function on all of these objects. So the Python equivalent of this is for, or the R equivalent would be for I in 1, 2, 3, 4 print I, something like that. But for JavaScript, it utilizes a lot of these anonymous functions. And d3.csv is one of those functions. So might make sense. So basically, when you have your so here as an example, in the JavaScript, we're not utilizing D3 because we're bringing in the data directly like this. But in that previous example that we were looking at, we have this CSV that's being read in here, and then you could see like it allows an error in the function. And a lot of these functions, the anonymous function has to be in a particular format. So in this case, it's you're looking at each row. So actually, let me do this. This will be good to show you guys both a bit more about JavaScript and some more console skills here. So if I wanted to test something out, so I see something like this, I see what's happening with these rows. You could like if you look at this a bit, you'll get a bit of an idea of what's happening to the but there's a lot of advanced stuff going on here. So if you did want to test out really what's happening, so in this case, let's first look at this Plotly d3.csv. Let's see what's happening. How can we tell something like that? So we have our CSV that we're reading in. We have our anonymous function that we're beginning to define. And for the simplest inspection, let's just try console logging. So this is really the simplest thing that we could do, and this is really the first step in terms of understanding what's happening. So we're bringing in this CSV. We're just going to console log row. And you kind of get this weird this weird style. You have your headers here. You have your this is how it shows arrays. So you can see this 0 through 99, and each of these are JSON objects. And so in terms of can anyone comment on what their thoughts of what the CSV must have initially looked like are? Like, what do you think the columns are? Does anyone on the call have any ideas about just based off of what you're seeing in my console here? Exactly. Exactly. So that's very good. So basically, what so as the CSV file is being read in, it's being read in what's called JSON format. So essentially, it's like here we have this right here. This is an array, and so we have an array of these JSON objects basically. So so what I could do is so now that I know that, I could maybe get a bit fancier with this. So let's say I wanted to yeah. So if row country equals, let's say, let's pick Sao Tome. And I think this was just a copy and paste error because you could see I got nothing. But what I was expecting was, let's see if is it just because I didn't use double quotes? Yeah, so you can see here, obviously nothing goes exactly how it's planned when you're testing things out like this, but this is good in terms of how you're, how you're able to, really kind of begin playing with these functions and learning what they're doing. So something like this, really the key things I wanted to touch on was this row here, it needs to be inside the CSV function, and so if I did something like this, let's say, like I'm thinking like I'm in R or Python, I see something like this where I want to bring in the data, and the natural inclination of a data scientist is to just bring it in memory and begin working with it. So you could almost imagine like the temptation would be saying something like used row equals row. It's bringing it in, and now let me inspect used row. I swear a lot of this must have changed with the new release of D3, because you used to not be able to do all this. And I remember that just being a huge, so that's good, this is improving. So really what's happening here is D3 has usually you're not able to access variables outside of like in a different context. So if you have your variable being defined in the function here, in the past, if I would enter in this use row, it would say the variable doesn't exist, and the you're kind of left with the question, what's happening? Did I do something wrong? Did I read in the CSV at all? But like for at least troubleshooting purposes, you're able to sort of use your console to at least test like what's going on. So one question I have based off of that is if you have two CSVs that you want to read at the same time, does anyone have any thoughts on how you would do that? So remember, we're assuming that like this is, and I'll actually have to inspect this a bit longer after this call, I think, because but when you're working in JavaScript, like the context, really does matter if you're building your app. But given the fact that you need to remain within the function, does anyone have any ideas of how they would read in two CSVs at the same time? So I'll start working towards a solution here. So if I had, I wanted to read in my function, my CSV. So I have, actually, I'll just use Tala. You have that almost correct, but there's one crucial point of information missing from that. So there are going to be two different d3.csv functions, but they have to be done in a certain way. Exactly. So Lou Wakame mentioned that it would be inside the first D3 function. So essentially, we're going to be nesting these D3.csv functions together. So really, what I would do is I would have something like this. And now what I'm able to do is I'm able to access any of these functions here. So I could say, I could like build a Plotly visualization, and I could say, I'm not going to do that now, but you could, access row 1, you could access row 2, etc. I could access these via loops. So I could say something like, row 1 dot actually just var x row 1 dot for each and then I could say something like if I think it's push. I always forget. I always get confused going between languages here. So I'll have to double check on that, but I'm pretty sure it's push. But just, x dot push. So you could see using a function like this, your include semicolons. So using a function like this, you're basically you're looping through your first CSV wherever the country is France. You're going to push GDP to an array, and this is unfortunately, this is really how low level you need to get when you're working with JavaScript. There's and cross filter JS, like for those of you who want to delve more in that direction. Cross filter really solves a lot of these problems, but without something like cross filter, all you're really left with is make it essentially these sorts of rudimentary looping procedures and building your visualization based off of that. So if you wanted to plot GDP versus GDP versus life expectancy, you're making the Hans Rosling chart. You're essentially building a lot of these arrays using these sorts of loops, and that's so that's just one thing to keep in mind when you're working with these sorts of with D3. But hopefully this will take away a bit of the mystery in terms of D3. And again, for homework 6, like feel free to try to consider it more of a hello world, sort of something hello world, like not really really just a visualization on an HTML page. And so assuming we're working towards something like that, are there any more questions that you guys have? And obviously things will be clear as you're going through the D3 book. And later this week, I have a video on. So what I found useful the last time I taught this was I had a separate video that was going through JavaScript events. But what might be so I'll add that, and if anyone, like after watching the JavaScript events video, if that seems like it's still, if that's still, too far advanced, or there's still questions that don't make sense, feel free to use the Ask the Instructor forum, and based off of student feedback, I'll create another intro video to kind of go through, what people still have questions on. But any other questions before we move on here? Cool. So we're already at the end of the hour, so I'm not going to go through homework 4. But does anyone have, just while we're here, does anyone have any questions on homework 4? Okay. And I also bit off a bit more than I could chew with this, trying to fit in too much for this lecture, but I also had some stuff that I wanted to mention just about notebooks in general, like wrapping up our Python, sort of our unit on Python and notebooks. So just looking at what I have here, and I want to keep. I'll just sort of quickly show that in full screen because I want to be able to look at the chat also. But so Reinhardt and Rogoff uh, has anyone come across these researchers, or does anyone have an idea of why I might be mentioning them when we're going over Jupyter notebooks? Before I, yep. So Ken Rogoff is an economist. I'm pretty sure they're both economists, and the and this was essentially what I'm referencing here is there was a particular paper co-authored by Reinhardt and Rogoff. Um, yeah, so Kemi mentioned that he's read articles about debts, and that's exactly what they wrote about. So the paper in particular that I'm referencing here, it was it was a paper with a specific, obviously like influential paper by influential economists, but it had a specific policy prescription, and in this case it was for it was essentially a policy prescription for developing economies, and the it was basically that there was a magic number of debt as a percentage of GDP. So debt as a percentage of GDP, like you just look at the debt clock that you have in New York, divide that by our GDP, and that would be our debt as a percentage of GDP. And do that with any country, and you'll end up with similar measures. And basically, Reinhardt and Rogoff, their paper showed that when your debt is below GDP, I think they were exclusively looking at fiscal policy, like essentially government spending. Um, Pretty sure it was just fiscal policy, but it might have been looking at like central bank policy as well. But the basic takeaway was you need to essentially there's this magic number 90%, having your debt at 90% of GDP. If your debt is below that, you're going to be okay. You're able to successfully use a lot of these tools, macroeconomic tools, to improve your economy, to get out of recessions. And if you're above 90%, then it's almost like a phase change. You end up not being able to use these tools. And a lot of this was adopted by, supposed to say, the international community, but this was basically adopted by the international community, in particular organizations like the IMF, World Bank, and a lot of times these particular organizations, they used it in as conditions for a lot of development loans. And so it's this it's a single paper, but it ended up like through a lot of these kind of I don't want to say quirks, but almost just the way that the theory paper was framed. It ended up really being a big deal in terms of international development. And you could sort of guess here, there was a big controversy with this paper. And it was basically discovered by a grad student who was trying to, for their thesis, replicate the results that Reinhardt and Rogoff found. And in particular, for economic papers, it's really easy to reproduce research. Most of this data is publicly available. You just go to individual countries, offices of statistics, and you're able to get the data that someone else used. So this grad student just followed all of the steps like a recipe, tried to rebuild it, and nothing was adding up. And he actually wrote to these wrote to these researchers, and told them what trouble he was running into. And it turned out that there was an error in one of their Excel sheets that they were using. And I wanted to sort of use this as since we were looking at notebooks and working within them, sort of use this to really talk about what reproducibility in research and research means for sort of the more professional world, because most people in our program were not going to be going towards a more academic track. But obviously, like using tools like GitHub, tending more towards the engineering side of things, like reproducibility, being able to keep track of what you're working on and sort of working collaboratively. These things still matter. So in terms of just what you guys would face in your careers, like I really see two major tracks that you could really look at reproducibility and research in terms of. The first one being production. So if you're, and this is more like if you're a data engineer, if you like a lot of uh, especially like ad agencies, when you're doing a lot of A/B testing, a lot of times like you have, some scratch work that you're working on, but the goal is to have your model be live. You want to be able to, display that pop up when a user moves, does a certain combination of movements or something like that, or you want to quantify, you have two types of a page, you want to be able to quantify whether or not a marketing push is going to be successful. So you're looking at, you want to sort of have it be more. So this is more larger scale. It's meant for longer term projects. Projects are bigger. You're going to have more people working on them. And this is really more of the sort of traditional, GitHub engineering use case. And what I found more interesting is really if you're working more on the analytics side and you're and kind of gaining more technical skills based off of sort of your day-to-day work as an analyst. Code is mostly code isn't really the end. It's the end. It's the means. You're facing a particular business problem. You want to express your analytical thoughts to perhaps a non-technical audience, and you want to really know how to do something like that. GitHub is used as well in cases like this, but it'll a lot of times be used in a less traditional way. But really, what matters here is, and this is really where something like notebooks could be more strongly used. And I kind of, tying this in with what happened with sort of tying it to an academic context as an example. And a lot of research is at least attempting to move this way, where along with a paper, you'll have a notebook produced, and all the code will be there, and someone would be able to, you can imagine a notebook like this being an academic paper. I published this, and then someone like you could almost think of the academic process, the scientific method, as essentially built. It is building off of each other's work, but it more directly becomes that when you are looking at tools like this. So this is I just thought this was sort of a good way of putting, like, this is really the last that we'll be looking at Python here, and a lot of times for I think like there's only a handful of courses that will be utilizing Python as you continue through the program. So this is just something to keep in mind. A lot of this applies to R Markdown as well. But sort of this provides a good context of looking at this kind of reproducibility. So for ending here, does anyone have any comments just on what they've faced in their own careers and in terms of reproducibility? All right. So unless what? Yeah. So Jonathan mentioned in the comments that sometimes people don't have the particular packages or software to run it. Um, there's a few there are a few projects out there, and none of them have really come to full fruition that are trying to address problems like this. So one thing in particular is Interact, which is this team is basically looking to make desktop-based notebooks. So like right now with Jupyter notebooks, you have to start the server, you have to you know run it through your terminal, and a lot of times that on its own, it's more difficult to maintain a Python environment than it is to maintain an R environment. You have pip, but you're it's it's not really. It can get more complicated. But this is really sort of one step towards eliminating some of those barriers. And on the kind of other side of that, you have a lot of. So I'm using Databricks as an example here, but you have a lot of almost AWS style hosting services like this. So Databricks, Domino Data Lab is another one that specializes in data science. And a lot of these platforms, they're built around notebooks. So they kind of, this is better for kind of an internal team, and everyone's set up in the same environment. And it really allows, data scientists to not have to worry about the back end architecture. They're just kind of working in a professional environment. They're able to easily collaborate, and it's so sort of in this other context, you kind of see like something like Databricks or even Jupyter Lab is kind of the next iteration of Jupyter notebooks, and they're kind of moving in that direction as well. And as you are and as you're learning more about this, like especially if you're moving on to like taking the recommender systems class, for example, you'll be setting that up in Spark, and it's you're essentially setting up an environment, and this is just kind of pie in the sky, like way down the line, but you could totally imagine these sorts of things morphing into sort of like you could imagine maybe an academic um, not paper. What are papers in? Academic journal. Being based on one of these services, and I think it's Authoria. That's yeah. You have some. So you have like a lot of companies out there that are looking at this sort of problem. So this is looking at sort of imagine if a journal article were just a notebook. And we have a few other comments here. Yeah, reproducibility is definitely more important in. I mean, it's important everywhere, but as you could see by the Reinhart Rogoff, when it's actually used in the real world, scientific reproducibility matters. Outside of just academia. Um, and Yoon asked about Docker. Docker is a Docker is more comparable to like virtual environments. Um, and I don't want to get too far into Docker, but I definitely recommend like you guys at least keep Docker like on your radar in terms of just tools you could because a lot of times like in professional contexts you'll be using Docker, but it's basically where you used to have a virtual machine. A Docker is a more containerized version of a virtual machine. It's I think it connects just at the kernel level, so it's cleaner. You're able to kind of make like it's different than using just kind of a virtual machine, like if you're using Wine to run Windows apps in a Mac. And then, yeah, Christopher mentioned about having R Markdown be reproducible. And that's actually what I mentioned before as one of the drawbacks of R Markdown. You can actually see this as a benefit when you're looking for reproducibility, because you don't have to worry about, oh, it's pointing to a different file, that file's not accessible, because it's all being shipped with the HTML. And Marco, that's an interesting comment about in medicine that Marco mentioned that journals are some medical journals are asking to send papers in R Markdown, and that's like, just personally, like in my experience with clients, like I've seen the biomedical community has had pretty heavy adoption of R. It seems like just kind of that's the way that adoption has happened there. Cool. So I think I'll end things here and let everyone go. So if anyone does have any more questions, feel free to email me, ask in the forums, and or ask in the forums. And for your homework 6, I'll be focusing on grading your proposals first. So watch out for those being graded, and once we get up to homework 6, and then so basically, like, start focusing on your final projects, and yeah, this is pretty much the getting towards the end of the course. So that's probably the best use of your time there. So I hope everyone has a good night. Thanks, and happy Halloween.